I think, like many of you, I have been troubled by the recent allegations of sexual misconduct, especially by those accusations towards Roy Moore, a candidate for the Senate seat in Alabama. It's tough enough trying to discern truth and fact in the midst of that. But part of what really bothered me was a number of Christian evangelicals who stepped forward in support of their candidate. And what bothered me about that, it was one particular state official who had stated, he said, well, if you look at the age difference between Mary and Joseph, while it's, a little unique, that age difference is not immoral. While unusual, that age difference seems to indicate it's not that big a deal. And I was surprised by that interpretation in many ways, not simply because that age difference is never mentioned in the Bible. It's always assumed. So it made me want to go back and look and reflect on and to think about who was Joseph. Who was he, really? Outside our buildup of tradition that seems to apply certain ideas about age and who he was. And what struck me as you read, he only shows up in 2 of the 4 Gospels. 2 of the 4 Gospels, the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew. He doesn't even have any speaking lines in any of those Gospels. He doesn't say a word. In Luke, he kind of shows up. He's not even a significant part of the birth story. Luke, which we'll look at next week, focuses on Mary. Matthew, he shows up in the long list of begetting. And he shows up in our story this morning. He does show up in Matthew a little bit later on, in which the angel warns him that he must flee to Egypt. But again, he doesn't speak a single word. He's like this ghost. And the story we read this morning, is about the only story we have about who Joseph was. He doesn't show up in any of the rest of the gospel. There's some reference later on that when Jesus is left at the temple by Mary and Joseph, that when they find Jesus again, he doesn't say a word. Mary speaks, but Joseph still doesn't speak. He doesn't show up later in the Gospels at all. In fact, his absence is conspicuous. The only reason we think he's a carpenter is that there's this one line in the Gospel of Matthew in which some villagers, in speaking about Jesus, say, well, he's the carpenter's son. Whenever Jesus encounters his family later, whenever Jesus has encounters with his family, Joseph is never mentioned. Miracle at the wedding at Cana, other instances, even the crucifixion, Joseph is conspicuous by his absence. So I never really thought about this. I just assumed I knew Joseph. And it made me wonder, who is Joseph? And part of me wonders, was he a hero or was he a kind of heel? And that question is up for grabs even in the story we read this morning. It says in the text, Joseph was a righteous man. And I'm not quite sure I know what is meant by righteous there. Well, does that mean he was a good man, a kind man, a caring man? Or does that mean he was a righteous man in that he followed Jewish law and the religious regulations and he did what he felt God called him to do. Hero or heel? Well, his culture, his tradition, his religious laws that he righteously follows tells him that he has to dismiss Mary. She's pregnant. He has to kick her out. Now, it's kind of interesting in this passage. It kind of says, well, he's a nice guy because he was going to kick her out quietly. Sounds more like a heel than a hero to me, if you think about it. But understandable in his culture, in his definition of what it means to be a man in his society. But he's going to be nice enough to dismiss her, but quiet. So what strikes me about this story, I think what kind of gives me a little bit of insight into Joseph, which there ain't much there, folks. The one thing, the simple aspect of this story, the thing that makes Joseph so important is he simply changes his mind. A dream in which he encounters an angel who says, God has blessed this. Joseph, despite the reality that he himself might become caught up in the disgrace of Mary's pregnancy, Joseph allied with Mary. He changed his mind and broke the rules that he was probably righteously known to do. That doesn't seem too radical in today's world. He changed his mind. You know, what's interesting about this story is even before Jesus is born, he's already breaking barriers, right? He's already shattering the rules and regulations. Jesus is the ultimate iconoclast. Even before he's born, he's challenging the morals and mores of his own society. This is the Jesus who breaks all the rules, who welcomes women into his community and considers them equals. This is the Jesus who reached out and loved those who were previously excluded outside God's covenant and grace. This is the Jesus who befriends all kinds of people and shatters all the rules and regulations in the interest of God's compassion and love. So already, even before Jesus is born, this Advent is about transformation. And this one small, tiny story of a man transformed and changed in anticipation of the birth of Jesus. And that really doesn't seem like much, but in reality, every encounter with Jesus changes us. Or it should. The Greek word for conversion is metanoia. And metanoia, in our tradition, we understand conversion not just simply to be a once-in-a-lifetime event, but essentially throughout our whole lives, this sense of conversion, of change. And metanoia isn't just simply changing one's intellectual thoughts or changing one's mind, kind of agreeing to this theological affirmation or to that one, or to saying the Bible is true, or saying this or that. It is metanoia. The Greek word means changing one's heart. And we can see in the Gospels that an encounter with Jesus transformed people's hearts, broke them open, and called them to love the unlovable, called them to challenge some of the rules and regulations, called them to challenge the very definition of what it means to be righteous. Not so much right action, but right love. To encounter Jesus is to have your heart changed. And I wonder how often we come here on Sunday morning expecting our hearts to change. I wonder, in our encounters with Jesus in our life and in this community, our hearts are broken open so that grace could abound. Because Jesus is change. And we might be frightened of it. We might be uncertain about it. It's kind of scary. But Jesus is a transformation. Much like Joseph was changed in anticipation of his birth. Are you willing to be changed this Advent? To have your heart open and offer forgiveness to someone you can't imagine forgiving? Are you willing to be changed this Advent? To offer welcome to someone you may be frightened of? Are you willing to have your heart transformed? That you'd risk disgrace in order for love to abound. One of my all-time favorite Christmas stories is A Christmas Carol. Anybody else here love that story? It's a beautiful story of change. And many of you may not know that Charles Dickens, who wrote it, I think about the early part of the 19th century, that Charles Dickens himself, who was a social critic of some of the greed and stinginess of his time, that he himself was a child of a man who had been imprisoned for 10 years in a debtor's prison, that at a young age he had to go work at a factory to support himself and his family. And Dickens, through this beautiful imagination, challenged much of the greed and stinginess and judgment of his time. And part of the reason I love A Christmas Carol is that it shows, in many ways, the possibility of transformation. Maybe that's what we love about it, that people's hearts can be changed to generosity and grace. That Scrooge, in many ways, scholars would argue, that Scrooge represented the Victorian society of his time, filled with that kind of stiffness and formality and greed and anger and judgment of those around them. In that, in telling the story of A Christmas Carol, Dickens is saying, through the love of God, we can change. We can be different. We can find that within us that makes us open to grace and love and compassion and welcome. The only question is, are you willing to change? To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.